Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this show. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. I am so very happy to be here. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs.
Mike Myers is one of those actors where people recognize the characters more than the career itself. And that already says a lot about how his success was built. For most audiences, especially outside the United States, he is remembered through specific roles like Austin Powers or the voice behind Shrek. But what often gets overlooked is just how dominant he was during his peak years. He was competing at the same level as the biggest comedy names in the industry. The kind of position where studios build projects around you because they know your name alone can carry attention. Before all the films and major roles, Mike Myers didn't come from a typical Hollywood background. He was born in Scarborough, Ontario and raised in Canada. But his environment was heavily shaped by British culture. Both of his parents were originally from the UK, and that influence shows up clearly later in his work, especially in the way he builds characters and uses accents as part of the performance. As a kid, he was already appearing in commercials, getting comfortable in front of the camera early on. That experience might seem small, but it gave him a head start in understanding how to perform and hold attention, and that's where everything begins to take shape. That kind of status doesn't come from one hit. It comes from a sequence of projects that connect at the right time. And for Myers, that sequence started in a very familiar place for comedians. Before the films, before the global recognition, everything began in television, where timing, character work, and audience reaction are built in real time. It's where performers learn what works and what doesn't. And more importantly, it's where they develop identities that can eventually move beyond the screen. For him, that platform was Saturday Night Live, a show that has launched more careers than almost any other comedy format. Being part of that environment means constant pressure to create something memorable, and once a character connects, it can grow far beyond its original context. That's exactly what happened in his case, because one of his characters didn't stay limited to short sketches. It expanded into something much bigger. That transition into film is always a risk because not every character can carry a full story, but when it works, it changes everything. Wayne's World became that turning point, and its success wasn't just moderate. It was strong enough to immediately shift how he was viewed in the industry. Instead of being seen as just another comedian coming out of television, he became a proven lead actor, someone who could deliver results at the box office. One of the most interesting parts of that early success is how much control he was already trying to take over creative decisions. During the production of Wayne's World, there was a disagreement about music, something that might seem minor on the surface but ended up becoming one of the most memorable elements of the film. The studio initially wanted to go in a different direction, choosing something more current and commercially safe. But Myers pushed back and insisted on using Bohemian Rhapsody instead. That decision could have gone either way, but it ended up working far beyond the film itself. After the release, Queen saw a resurgence in popularity in the United States, something that tied directly back to that scene. Moments like that reinforce confidence, because when a creative choice leads to results, not just inside the film, but outside of it, it builds the belief that trusting your instincts works. That belief becomes important later, especially when those same instincts are tested under pressure. The success of Wayne's World was undeniable. It generated strong numbers relative to its budget and held its position at the box office long enough to prove it wasn't just a short-term reaction. That kind of performance changes expectations immediately. Once a studio sees that level of return, the focus shifts from building something carefully to capitalizing on momentum as quickly as possible. That's where the next phase begins, and it's also where the first cracks start to show. The demand for a sequel came almost immediately, and with that demand came a much shorter timeline. Instead of taking the time to refine the story and build on what worked in the first film, everything was pushed forward quickly. Scripts weren't fully polished, ideas weren't fully developed, and the result reflected that. The sequel didn't fail completely, but it didn't match the impact of the original, and that difference matters more than it might seem. When the first project sets a high standard, anything that falls short creates a noticeable gap, and once that gap appears, it becomes harder to maintain the same trajectory. It doesn't erase the earlier success, but it changes the direction moving forward. That shift becomes even more clear with the next project. Instead of stabilizing after the sequel, the pattern continues, and another film fails to connect with audiences. At this point, it's no longer just one underperforming project, it becomes a sequence. And sequences are what start to shape perception in the industry. One weak result can be overlooked, but multiple in a row start to raise questions. Rather than pushing through that phase, Myers takes a different approach. He steps away. This isn't a common move, especially for someone who has already reached a high level of success, because staying visible is usually the priority. But in his case, stepping back creates space, not just to reset, but to rethink what kind of project he actually wants to pursue. That decision becomes the step for the next major shift in his career. Instead of returning with something safe or predictable, he moves toward a concept that allows him to fully lean into his style. Something exaggerated, self-aware, and built around his strengths as a performer. That project would eventually become Austin Powers, and it would take his career into an entirely different phase. That next phase begins with a completely different kind of idea. Something that doesn't try to repeat what worked before, but instead leans fully into exaggeration. Austin Powers wasn't built to feel grounded or realistic. It was built to push things further, to take a familiar concept and stretch it until it became absurd. And that approach is exactly what made it stand out. At the time, the James Bond franchise had just regained momentum with a more modern version that was performing well globally. Instead of competing with that directly, Myers saw an opportunity in a different direction. He recognized that the tone of those films, when pushed just slightly further, could become something comedic. And instead of playing it safe, he leaned into that idea completely. The first Austin Powers film didn't explode immediately in theaters. Its initial box office performance was solid, but not overwhelming. The kind of result that suggests potential rather than dominance. Under normal circumstances, that might have been the end of it, or at least a sign to keep expectations controlled. But what happened next changed everything. Once the film moved to home video, it reached a much wider audience, and this time the reaction was different. The humor connected more, the characters became more recognizable, and the film started building a following that didn't depend on its theatrical run. It turned into something that people kept going back to, and that kind of engagement matters more than a single weekend at the box office. That shift is what transformed Austin Powers from a modest success into a cultural phenomenon. It created demand that wasn't driven by marketing alone, but by audience response. And once that kind of momentum builds, studios move quickly to expand on it. A sequel was approved, but this time the conditions were different. There was more confidence, more budget, and more room to push the concept further. When the second film arrived, the results reflected that growth. It performed on a much larger scale, bringing in significantly higher numbers and reaching a wider audience. At that point, Myers wasn't just part of a successful project. He was leading one of the biggest comedy franchises of that time, and that position comes with a different level of influence. What makes this period interesting is how it didn't just impact his own career. The exaggerated parody in Austin Powers started affecting how audiences viewed the very thing it was parodying. The humor didn't stay contained within the film. It changed perception. Characters that were once taken seriously began to feel unintentionally comedic by comparison. And that shift had real consequences for similar franchises trying to maintain their tone. By the time the second film had finished its run, Myers had fully re-established himself at the top of the industry. The earlier setbacks were no longer the focus. What mattered now was the scale of success he had reached again, and this time it extended beyond one franchise. That's when another major opportunity came in, one that didn't rely on his physical presence at all, but instead on his voice and character work. He was cast as the lead voice in Shrek, a project that would become one of the biggest animated films of its time. Voice acting operates differently from live action, but in this case, his performance carried just as much weight. The character connected with audiences across different age groups and regions, and because animated films reach a global audience, the impact was even wider. Even in places where the film was dubbed, the character itself remained tied to his performance. The success of Shrek added another layer to his career. Now he wasn't just known for live-action comedy, but also the voice behind one of the most recognizable animated characters of that era. That kind of dual presence strengthens an actor's position because it expands their reach across different types of audiences. His work on Austin Powers continued, leading into another sequel that pushed things even further. The third film brought in larger budgets, bigger production scale, and more involvement from other well-known actors willing to make appearances. That level of participation shows how strong the franchise had become. Because when a project reaches that point, it attracts attention from across the industry. Financially, the film still performed well, maintaining its position as a successful entry in the series. But something had started to change. The perception wasn't as strong as before, and while the numbers remained high, the response from audiences began to shift. That difference between financial success and audience reaction is important, because long-term momentum depends on both. At this stage, everything still looks stable on the surface. Multiple successful films, strong recognition, and continued presence in major projects. But underneath that, the pattern is starting to shift again. Not in a sudden way, but gradually, in a way that only becomes clear when you look at what happens next. Because after reaching that level of success, the next decision becomes critical. Whether to continue building on what works, or move into something different, and in his case, that next move doesn't go the way the earlier ones did. The next phase of a career usually depends on choosing the right projects to sustain momentum. In Myers' case, that next move didn't come from a clear creative direction, but from a situation that had been building behind the scenes. It started with a project he was originally supposed to make with the studio, something that had already gone through development and had resources committed to it. At some point during that process, he decided not to continue. The script wasn't working for him, and instead of moving forward with something he wasn't satisfied with, he chose to step away entirely. From a creative standpoint, that decision makes sense. But from a business standpoint, it created a problem because the studio had already invested heavily in the project. That's where things escalated. The studio responded by taking legal action, seeking compensation for the money that had already been spent and for the potential losses tied to the project not moving forward. Situations like this don't usually play out publicly in full detail, but they often end in some form of agreement. And in this case, the resolution came with a condition. Instead of continuing the original project, Myers had to appear in a different film chosen by the studio. That film became The Cat in the Hat, and from the start, it wasn't something he wasn't interested in doing. This matters because when a project begins without alignment between the actor and the material, it often shows during production. The filming process itself became difficult. Reports from the set described tension, lack of communication, and disagreements about how scenes should be handled. He reportedly kept to himself, avoided interacting with much of the crew, and focused mainly on working directly with the director. That kind of environment doesn't support a smooth production, and over time, it contributed to delays and rising costs. The budget increased significantly, and by the time the film was completed, it had reached a level that made it harder to recover financially unless the film performed extremely well. When it was finally released, the response didn't match what was needed. While it managed to generate some revenue, the reception from audiences and critics was weak, and the overall result was seen as a failure. What made the situation worse was it affected perception. Without the full context of the contractual issues behind the film, most of the blame was directed at him. The narrative that formed around the project focused on his behavior rather than the circumstances that led to it, and that kind of public perception can have a lasting impact on a career. After that, he stepped away again, returning mostly to voice work while staying out of major live-action roles. But the next attempt to come back into the spotlight didn't reset things the way earlier projects had. Instead, it pushed the situation further in the same direction. That project was The Love Guru, a film built around a character that had originally been created during the development of Austin Powers but never fully used. Bringing that character back years later and building an entire film around it carried a risk, because not every idea that gets cut from a successful project is strong enough to stand on its own. In this case, that risk didn't pay off. The film failed both commercially and critically, generating far less revenue than expected and receiving strong negative reactions. It wasn't just another underperforming project, it became a defining moment in how his career was viewed at that point. When a film reaches that level of failure, it does more than affect one project. It changes how studios approach future opportunities. The confidence that once led to large budgets and creative freedom starts to disappear, and replacing that level of trust takes time, if it happens at all. His presence in live-action films became even more limited. He appeared in smaller roles, took long breaks, and chose not to pursue projects simply for the sake of staying visible. At one point, he stepped away from acting for several years entirely, which is unusual for someone who had previously been so active. There were opportunities to return in a bigger way. Continuing the Austin Powers franchise was always an option, even if the script wasn't perfect. The audience was still there, and the recognition hadn't disappeared, but he chose not to move forward unless the project met his standards, and that decision reflects a different priority. Instead of trying to rebuild momentum quickly, he focused on maintaining control over what he was involved in. That approach comes with trade-offs, because while it protects the quality of what you choose to do, it also limits how often you appear. When he eventually returned to film, it wasn't in leading roles but in smaller appearances, including projects that connected back to earlier parts of his career. One of those appearances came in a film centered around Bohemian Rhapsody, which tied back to one of the most important creative decisions he made early on. In recent years, his work has shifted more toward television and selective projects rather than large-scale film roles. The pace is slower, the appearances are less frequent, and the focus is different from what it was during his peak years. Looking at the full trajectory, the pattern becomes clear. The rise was built on strong creative instincts, timing, and characters that connected with audiences. The shift came from a combination of rushed projects, decisions that didn't land the same way, and circumstances that affected both production and perception. What makes his story different is how he handled the later stages of his career. Instead of continuing to take on more projects as opportunities became less consistent, he stepped back. He chose to limit his appearances rather than gradually fade through smaller and less impactful roles. That decision changes how the career is remembered, because instead of a long decline filled with forgettable projects, there's a clear distinction between the peak and everything that followed, and in a way that might be the most defining part of it, not just how high the success reached, but how it was handled once it started to shift. Not every career ends the way it starts. Subscribe for more and let me know what you think.